Welcome to today's webinar, Toxic Floodwaters, Innovative Strategies to Prevent Climate-Driven Pollution and Chemical Disasters. This is the third in a three-part series on toxic floodwaters and the climate crisis. I'm Brian Gumm, the Communications Director at the Center for Progressive Reform. CPR is an action-oriented think tank that leverages a national network of law professors and other academics with a team of analysts to drive public policy for a just America. Working alongside public interest groups and frontline communities, CPR builds tools and strategies to inform policymakers and support people and communities on critical issues related to health, safety, equity, and the environment. We are also looking ahead, envisioning the future direction of sound policy to protect the public, make our government work for us, and build a better, more sustainable future. You can learn more about our work on our website at www.progressivereform.org. Today's webinar will be moderated by CPR Senior Policy Analyst David Flores. David?
Thank you, Brian. Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to you all attending this webinar. Thank you for making time to join this really exciting discussion today. And I also want to thank a really exciting panel of speakers that are joining us today to discuss climate-driven and extreme weather-induced pollution and chemical disaster. Professor Robin Kundis Craig is a CPR member scholar and professor at law at the University of Utah College of Law. Welcome, Robin. Chris Kilian is Vice President of Strategic Litigation with the Conservation Law Foundation. And Professor Noah Sachs, CPR member scholar and professor at the University of Richmond School of Law. Thank you all three for joining us today for this discussion. Noah, I'd love to start by asking you a question.
Sure,
you and I've worked a little bit in this space, researching some of these issues in Virginia. Can you share more with the other panelists and the attendees today about why you think existing environmental laws are not adequately controlling the problem of toxic flooding, flood-induced pollution, and how these gaps in federal safeguards present particular challenges for communities and local governments?
Sure. Well, David and I had the pleasure of working together for several years on the issue of toxic floodwaters in Virginia. And it was interesting to approach this issue from the state level, because what we found is that there are several gaps in federal law, long-standing gaps. And so in the near term, we thought a lot more progress could be made at the state level. But why don't I begin by talking about where those gaps are in federal law? And let's move through the slides here. First of all, this issue of toxic floodwaters is often phrased as an issue of hurricanes, and we have a photo there of Hurricane Harvey from Texas. But what we found is it's much bigger than that. Hurricane Florence, for instance, in 2018, didn't hit many industrial sites, but it hit a lot of hog farms, poultry farms. And so it was agricultural contamination that contaminated the water in that area of Eastern North Carolina. And that's something that's often left out of this conversation. Next slide. Another thing that's often left out is inland flooding. This is not just a coastal issue. Whether it's Iowa, whether it's Nebraska, whether it's the Mississippi, the Ohio River, we've had several recent cases of severe flooding in the inland United States with impacts on industry and agriculture. Next slide. So looking specifically at Virginia, David and I wrote this report in 2019, and for the activists and the regulators on the call, we believe that the most important thing was to get an inventory of how many sites are really exposed, what's the scope of the problem. So that's what this report was about. It looked just at the James River watershed in Virginia. And we identified more than 2,700 industrial sites that probably contain toxic chemicals based on what we could tell, given the statutes they were regulated under. And then we looked specifically at facilities that were in communities that were low income and that ranked high on the CDC's index of social vulnerability. So that was our kind of data set. And we combined that data set with looking at elevation data to figure out, well, which of these facilities are really in danger of flooding and releasing toxic chemicals. And we identified 1,095 facilities just in a single river basin in Virginia. Next. And more than 473,000 Virginians live in those areas. This is our key map from the report, where each orange dot shows a single facility. And this is a kind of a 35,000 feet up view. But if you zoomed in on Richmond in the middle of the map, or Hampton Roads on the right-hand side of the map, you would see that these facilities are everywhere in our major cities. Next. Yeah, so why is the Clean Water Act failing to address this issue? So principally, the Clean Water Act for 50 years has been about establishing permitting programs to regulate the intentional discharge of pollutants into water. It really has very few provisions and very little to say on storage of hazardous substances near our waterways where those facilities are not directly discharging. The Act has pretty comprehensive regulations for oil tanks that are located near waterways, but nothing for chemical storage tanks. And there's a whole history of why this is, because if you look at the Act, Section 311J, 1972, Congress calls for comprehensive regulation of how we store oil and how we store hazardous substances. The oil tank regulations were enacted 2 years later. The hazardous substance regulations have never been enacted. 50 years later, we're still waiting for them. And I think in Q&A, I can go into the reasons why, but it's been in action under Democratic and Republican administrations. I really hope that the Biden administration makes this a top priority agenda item at EPA. Next. Then one other statute I want to mention that's relevant to this issue is EPCRA, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act of 1986. This act seems like it would be directly on point for notifying communities, preventing toxic releases, and preparing through planning and notification to respond to toxic releases. But it's been a bit of a paper tiger. This is not a very substantial statute. In most states, it is widely under enforced. David and I found in Virginia that there's exactly one employee at our state DEQ who's charged with implementing this act. And part of the problem is that it has this well-known title component of it, the toxic release inventory, where companies have to disclose if they're releasing toxic chemicals into the environment. And this one is well publicized, pretty well run. States put this on their websites, it's updated every year, and it's often tracked pound for pound. How are we doing on TRI? But this other part of the act is much less well known. Section 312, Emergency and Hazardous Chemical Inventory. So this requires reporting by plants if they are storing chemicals, hazardous chemicals on site, but not releasing them to the environment. So for the issue of toxic floodwaters and our concern about factories and plants and tanks posing threats during flood conditions, it's Section 312 that is the major part of EPCRA that's relevant. Next slide. And so these forms, it's a bit haphazard. As I said, there's not very strong enforcement to make sure that companies are actually filing their forms and disclosing what they have on site. But more importantly, there's no follow-up authority in EPCRA for local or even state authorities to do anything about a problem once they find out through disclosure that there are hazardous chemicals that are stored, let's say, within 10 feet of a waterway. EPCRA is a disclosure statute. It doesn't have any prescriptive standards for what you're supposed to do about a risk. And that's really left to local planning, and it is not well implemented at all. The other place where EPCRA is really falling down is on public access to the data. While the TRI information is disclosed, I believe, on all 50 states' websites, the inventory information is not. It's hard to get. Illinois is the only state that makes it publicly available. Virginia did not, and David and I had to file a FOIA request to get this information from DEQ. And it strikes me that this was passed as a community right to know statute, and yet here it is, the critical information about protecting ourselves from toxic floodwaters, and we really don't have access to it as the general public. So yeah, I'll stop there, David.
Thank you, Noah. I also want to observe that not only are there issues with transparency, public access to these records, there's a sort of a tremendous burden, even on advocates, to know how to interpret this information, right, and to analyze it. So a lot that needs to be done in that space. Robin, thank you for joining us. I know you've been researching and writing about climate adaptation and regulation of pollution for a number of years. And more recently, you've focused on the phenomenon of toxic contamination along our coastlines, driven in part by things like rising sea levels and storms, but also, of course, regulatory failings of different kinds. Can you tell us what reforms policymakers should consider and how these reforms should be implemented to protect human health and ocean resources?
Okay, great. And I'm the next slide. Is my start. There we go. So I think all of us are going to touch on Hurricane Harvey, which has become a very good demonstration of toxic floodwater problems. And so part of getting at what reforms we need is realizing what it was running into. And Noah's quite right. There are a lot of different flooding issues and a lot of facilities we need to think about. But this map sort of shows what Harvey slammed into in Houston. We have wastewater treatment facilities. As most of us with the Clean Water Act know, there are still a lot of wastewater treatment facilities that are incredibly vulnerable to flood events, particularly if you have combined sewer overflows, but even if not. E. coli, among other bacteria, is not a pleasant thing to have released into the community. The yellow squares here are toxic release inventory sites, so some knowledge about what those sites were. The orange squares, to the extent you can see them, are the petroleum refineries, and the orange dots are petroleum product terminals. Obviously, Houston, much more than many places a hurricane could have hit, had the petroleum industry right there. Natural gas processing facilities, and natural gas terminals. So a fairly heavy concentration of potentially toxic sites in multiple ways. Next slide. So it's worth seeing the pictures again to remember what a hurricane does to an oil refinery. I do like to focus on the coast because both sea level rise and increasing hurricane activity, and this year's hurricanes are a great demonstration of increased hurricane activity, are givens under climate change. And as the sea level rises, the impact of coastal storms, even if they're not hurricanes, goes up considerably. So again, Houston has those oil refineries, storage tanks holding crude oil, gasoline, other toxic contaminants failed multiple times during Hurricane Harvey, spilled at least 145,000 gallons of fuel, but they also polluted the air. And that was one of the things Harvey taught us, is that toxic floodwaters aren't just a water pollution problem, they can become an air pollution problem as well. and parts of Houston were experiencing 325 parts per billion of benzene, which if you were working indoors, you would need respirators to be able to deal with that. Next slide. And then, of course, there was the Arkema chemical plant, which blew up, and there's a criminal trial related to that ongoing as we speak. But it lost power, it lost refrigeration. A lot of the toxic chemicals, including organic peroxides that had to be kept cold, exploded. It flooded out in 40 inches of rain. And there was a 1.5-mile radius around the plant that had to be evacuated because of the things, again, going both into water and into the air coming off of that plant. And this isn't new. Harvey was perhaps a particularly dramatic example of the toxic load in our coasts and what happens when freshwater and saltwater hits that load. But we knew this before. So when Katrina hit New Orleans, there was arsenic contamination, there was lead contamination afterwards. That lead probably came from lead-based paint in demolished buildings. So there's another source we don't usually think about. When Superstorm Sandy or Hurricane Sandy hit New York and New Jersey, we had all sorts of fuel spilling. We had hospitals getting flooded out. Again, we had waste treatment plants being flooded out and all manner of substances going into those floodwaters. So not new. We know this happens. We know there are a lot of sources of toxic pollutants on the coast, and saltwater and freshwater do a pretty darn good job in combination of dissolving pretty much anything you might have. So next slide. We do know that hurricanes are becoming more frequent. One of the things that's interesting about Hurricane Harvey, next slide, is it was the first storm event where it could be statistically shown that the severity of the storm was almost certainly related to climate change. Not its existence, still not there on the science, but its severity, the amount of rain, and the fact that it stalled out was the first time. There were two independent groups of scientists that showed that relationship. So we know that climate change is making things worse, contributing to the amount of water that is being dumped on these sites. And we know there are public health impacts from these. So this was a graveyard that was basically destroyed. Corpses coming to the surface, which is not good on many levels. But we get disease organisms in the waters like Vibrio vulnificus, which is very toxic bacteria. So after many of these hurricanes, there were cases in Texas and Florida. This can be a flesh-eating bacteria if you get it into a wound. That was occurring. We have, as I said, many different kinds of pollutants getting into the floodwaters, getting into land, and we had raw sewage exposure. The fact that there was not a massive public health problem after Katrina is as much a stroke of luck as anything else, because there were certainly the bacteria, E. coli, salmonella, hepatitis A, all circulating in those floodwaters. So a lot to worry about there. And so, David, I'm finally getting to your actual question. What kind of legal strategy can we pursue? Besides the Clean Water Act, we do have CERCLA, RCRA, the state analogs, the brownfields legislation. So we could very much be putting a higher priority on cleaning up these sites that are within floodplains along the coast where we know they're likely to encounter major storms and hurricanes. We could engage, and this is more at the state and local level, in more toxic aware land use planning. Do you really need to site this toxic facility along the coast next to a river? Is there a really good reason why it has to be there? Or maybe we should put it someplace a little bit safer? And then third, next slide. Yeah, we can enact building codes that minimize releases. There's some really cool architecture out there just in terms of building designs. And again, this is a more local code or a state code that could be imposed, but buildings that are designed to withstand storms, designed to withstand hurricanes, advance, and that are wind resistant, that are water resistant. Again, one more, there we go. And very futuristic looking, but designed to survive both sea level rise and these storms without releasing anything that happens to be inside the building. So those are 3 starting points we could use to get at these issues.
Thank you, Robin. That's really interesting. Chris, thank you for joining us today for this discussion. It occurs to me that you are drilling down deep on these issues, including specific sites. Can you start by describing to us all how you and your organization, the Conservation Law Foundation, came to litigate major fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil and Shell to address some of the climate vulnerabilities and risks of toxic pollution at coastal facilities in New England?
Sure. Well, I was planning on starting on that first slide for a moment before jumping in, but so in terms of our process to moving forward with certain litigation cases, I guess I would start by saying we currently have cases pending under the Federal Clean Water Act with a focus on the stormwater program, but also other aspects of the Clean Water Act, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and in particular, the hazardous waste generator rule and the imminent and substantial endangerment citizen suit provision of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, focused on liquid petroleum storage and transloading terminals in New England. So we have a case in federal district court in Massachusetts against ExxonMobil, a case against Shell and Shell Oil Products US and some of its subsidiaries in the Port of Providence, which I'll talk about in some detail. And then we have notices of intent to sue pending, dealing with 3 sets of terminals in New Haven Harbor in Connecticut, one also Shell and some of its affiliated entities, the other Gulf Oil, and then 3 terminals that have had different ownership over time, but recently were owned by Magellan Midstream Partners and are now owned by a subsidiary entity of Buckeye Pipeline. In any case, each of these terminals is located in New England ports, essentially at bulkhead height, in all 3 instances on filled land filled areas of estuary, in locations that are in proximity to communities and are of significant concern to local communities that would be affected by any spill or other harm that would come to these facilities. And then I guess I would refer back to Professor Sachs' reference to longstanding regulations with regard to petroleum above ground storage tanks having a component of regulation under the Clean Water Act in particular. And lastly, the companies that we have noticed or filed suit against were leaders for many decades in researching and understanding climate change related impacts. And there's a lot of debate about their actions in the 90s and early 2000s with regard to denying climate science or seeking to forestall regulation. But the reality is that these companies have known for decades with increasing sophistication about climate change related risks. And so that underlying credibility and knowledge base in those companies really underscored why we think not only is it good engineering practice and should it be known that reasonably foreseeable climate-related risks should be addressed in the design, operation, and maintenance of these facilities to avoid the kind of risks that we're experiencing already. But these companies in particular have been leaders and well aware of those problems, and their inaction is particularly egregious in that regard. Next slide. I started with this quote from the Dalai Lama because it makes kind of our core point that planning is important here, that we've seen significant impacts and risks, and we all know that there's just more to come, and now is the time for companies, entities that are storing dangerous materials that can cause severe community and environmental harm to be taking action to forestall those risks. And it's entirely foreseeable and possible, and we can't do it overnight, so let's get started. I wanted to underscore that for many, many years, including today, and you can go to the EPA website right now, the URL is there. EPA has acknowledged in the enforcement context that the Clean Water Act in the enforcement context of necessity and common sense will obligate consideration of climate change related impacts. And that is the policy of US EPA today and guidance, and it entirely stands to reason and is the case. Our cases are focused on the longstanding obligation in the stormwater program and other aspects of the Clean Water Act for companies to apply good engineering practice to creation and implementation of stormwater pollution prevention plans, and also the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, underscoring that imminent and substantial foreseeable risks of environmental or public health harm are subject to enforcement as well. Next slide. We can actually skip this next slide. Others have covered it. We know things are bad and they're getting worse. I'm going to talk in a little bit of detail right now about our case against Shell, because it's of the cases that we filed, it's perhaps the most advanced at this point in time. The citation is there. Next slide. I'm projecting this slide. I would urge people to go take a look. In 1991, Shell put out a close to half-hour long documentary, essentially called Climate of Concern, that it was incredibly prophetic in its how it foresaw what would unfold across the globe with climate change. And this is an important benchmark for us because it puts to bed that Shell and its affiliated entities have known for decades exactly that, well, not exactly, but climate was a major concern and was actionable even then. And I would urge people to Google this and view it. Next slide. Just a couple of slides to orient around the Shell terminal in Providence, in the Port of Providence. The facility is far up in the headwaters of Narragansett Bay on the Providence River, an area where climate change related storm surge and tidal impacts would be massively magnified with a direct hit from any storm, area that has seen flooding and has been flooded in the past. Next slide. This is a look from downtown Providence out into Narragansett Bay, and the terminal is on the right. You can see some of the tanks on the right side of the water downstream of the bridges and the hurricane barrier. Next slide. So our claims, again, are under the Clean Water Act. We have numerous subclaims under the Federal Clean Water Act based on permits that apply to these facilities under the stormwater provisions of the Clean Water Act and otherwise. At their core, we are alleging that these entities failed to consider and prepare for climate change related impacts, including sea level rise, increased storms, flooding, rise in sea temperatures, storm surges, and under numerous provisions of their stormwater pollution prevention plans and general permitting obligations. And then again, under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, arguing that these foreseeable events create imminent and substantial risks of endangerment of public health and the environment. Next slide. Just another, these are FEMA firms for the facility. You can see that much of the facility is already even under the firms in harm's way. We have a, next slide. We have a long procedural history. The case is now 3 years old. Next slide. This in August, we argued, we and the opposing side argued the shell entity's motion to dismiss, and virtually all aspects of the shell entity's motion to dismiss were denied by Judge Smith in the Federal District Court of Rhode Island. We have standing to sue, and our Clean Water Act and RCRA claims can be tried. Of note, in terms of good engineering practice and other aspects of our case, and this is true both with regard to the Shell case and the Exxon case in Massachusetts, which has also survived a motion to dismiss, both courts acknowledged that reasonably foreseeable severe weather events into the future, including those associated with climate change, were appropriate to be considered in the context of good engineering practice and the other claims that we raised. And in particular, we talked with both courts about what we know about committed climate change related impacts, those things that are virtually certain to occur out into the future, even some decades, even if we turned off all the emissions today. And then second of all, we talked with both courts about the design life of these facilities and the fact that this is durable infrastructure and that anything that is done to design, operate, and maintain these facilities moving forward has to consider the design life of the infrastructure extending out into the future. And that served in part as the basis for the court's denial of the motions to dismiss. Now we're moving toward trial into the discovery phase in the Shell case. Next slide. We talked about these already. I do want to underscore that the Exxon case moved past a motion to dismiss, but the judge there stayed the case based on the fact that EPA has a pending application for a permit renewal, and that aspect of the case is at the First Circuit Court of Appeals and will be argued in early December. Next slide. So the only other thing I wanted to mention is that EPA recently, actually work that we have been doing with David, continued to include the good engineering practice standard in a draft renewal of the industrial stormwater permit that applies to thousands of facilities across the country, but also added a specific flooding provision for the first time in that regulatory program. It's good news that they are actually addressing this question. The bad news is that they're proposing an approach that actually undermines the good engineering practice standard by relying solely on the FEMA firms, which are not intended to be utilized in this way and don't consider climate change in order to establish base flood elevations. And we recently saw this same language show up in a permit that's out for public notice right now in EPA New England in the Boston Harbor watershed, a Citgo tank farm located on the Fore River in Braintree, Massachusetts. So we will be providing extensive comments to EPA on that as well. And I guess that sums it up for now.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. I want to take a big step back for a second and recognize that the challenge of coastal flooding, right, and climate impacts is not just narrow, obviously, to toxic contamination and pollution or wastewater contamination, and then also that we are in this place in time right now, moving into the next presidential administration. And I want to ask you, Robin, my point being that, sea level rise, the extreme weather events are not just generating toxic pollution, they're impacting communities in a myriad of ways. And so, for this next administration, is there a need? What is the opportunity to sort of marry various coastal flooding issues in a single strategy for regulatory reform?
Well, it would be nice to have a unified approach. Of course, one of the legal issues that you run into immediately is we do have a federalism system. And so part of the coasts have been very stringently litigated to be the state's responsibility. But it would be nice to have an overall approach, strategy, set of priorities that hopefully the federal government, the states, and local communities could all sort of work toward together. And I do think it will take government at all levels, unless we do some major changes to how we do government in the United States. But part of that is just recognizing that the coasts are changing, and that we do have to start thinking about moving inland and decommissioning things that are on the coast. I actually take, in a very weird way, great comfort in the fact that the U.S. Department of Defense and the U.S. Navy takes all of this very seriously. And I think they are providing, have continued to provide some leadership. But there are other things. We could think about reprioritizing how we do circle cleanups. Again, maybe think about things that are near flood areas should be higher on the list than maybe they currently are. We can think, in addition to how we do Clean Water Act permitting, how do we do RCRA permitting? There are siting provisions, there are site construction provisions in RCRA permitting that could be more aligned toward a goal of not having these huge toxic areas, as everyone is going to be moving around, which everyone is going to be doing. We could think, more creatively about maybe some reforms to the Coastal Zone Management Act, making coastal zone management plans more responsive to climate change, and providing some additional federal monies to states to make that happen. We have a national flood insurance program that is being bankrupt by hurricanes. It's been reauthorized on a piecemeal basis for about 4 or 5 years now. The last one was last month for the next year. And that statute needs a serious rethink about how we're going to deal with climate change, how we draw flood maps, how we think about flood risk in climate change. So like I said, I think it's going to take an all of the above sort of approach. But again, having some national leadership on what priorities actually should be, particularly in the climate change adaptation arena, would be very helpful in trying to herd all of the cats in sort of the same direction. So that's where I would look.
Thank you, Robin. Noah, Chris, would you like to respond to that question and your ideas for maybe how there could be some synergy in federal policymaking on climate impacts more broadly that connects to some of these pollution issues?
I would just start by saying we think there are a lot of obligations already in place in federal law, and also through the lens of reasonable behavior. Industry really advocated for a system, particularly in the Clean Water Act context, of professional engineer certification and reliance on narrative standards like good engineering practice. That's what they wanted. And good engineering practice now dictates that really any good engineer operating, designing, or maintaining a facility in harm's way consider these impacts. And I'm all for reform, but I'm also all for accountability, particularly where a lot of these entities have demonstrated time and again that when it's in their interest, they design facilities very robustly with new investments, taking climate change related impacts into account. And we shouldn't only have a system where new investments that are being made by companies are protected against future harm in their interest, but at existing facilities that create grave risks to the public ends up bearing all of that cost and risk. It's time that those obligations are enforced and these facilities are actually brought into the modern age.
Yeah, and just very quickly, I want to pick up on the land use issue that Robin raised. That does need to be a unifying theme as well. Where are we going to locate facilities that would pose hazards to the public in the event of a release? And I agree with Chris that it's got to look at existing facilities and new facilities. So in a new article that I'm about to release in Columbia Journal of Environmental Law, I talk about what that kind of land use strategy could look like. And I say, look, we ought to start with state and local governments in a kind of industrial zoning to keep the most hazardous facilities out of flood zones, because the flood insurance program standing alone is not doing that. And then I raised the possibility that the federal government may need to step in if states aren't doing it. And I'm not saying that the federal government will take charge of land use for every business in the United States. But I'm talking about the largest kinds of facilities: chemical manufacturing, oil refining, industries that store above a certain threshold of chemicals. I think it would be within the Commerce Clause authority of the federal government to have siting standards for where those facilities can be located.
Interesting. Thank you, Noah. Chris, I wanted to follow up on if you're willing to open the hood a little bit more on some of your litigation work. You know, it seems to me it's not just the industry engineers, right, that need to be thinking about these climate vulnerability risks, but also regulators, right, in state agencies, at EPA, those responsible for monitoring compliance and undertaking enforcement. And so my question is, you know, what have you learned through your own citizen enforcement work that you think would be instructive to those regulatory agencies as they consider, you know, the criteria or processes to identify and respond to some of these risks as part of their enforcement programming?
Well, I want to underscore that I think EPA in the states, in adopting a good engineering practice standard and applying certain narrative obligations, overlays like compliance with state water quality standards and the like, have really been forward-looking, because the reality is that the moment you adopt a very specific standard based on a certain set of facts right now, you risk essentially freezing in time the adaptation that needs to occur. And that is particularly of concern with regard to climate change. We have states like Rhode Island that have already adopted the NOAA high sea level rise curve as a future looking design standard. Unfortunately, in that state permitting program, not applying to existing facilities. But adopting these narrative standards assures that things are not frozen in time and that the burden of compliance is placed on industry actors, regulated entities. And, you know, we place as a society a lot of faith in professional engineers. And it's not fair and appropriate to say, we're going to design a bridge to a very, very low risk threshold, because we don't want it to fall down, which is totally appropriate, but we're going to have a loosey-goosey approach when it comes to large scale storage of chemicals and petroleum products right on the edge of the harbor. That's not fair and appropriate. It's not consistent. It's not good engineering practice. So I think there's an accountability component, particularly where industry argued for a lot of these certification programs and not having EPA be too prescriptive. We always hear, I've heard many times in my career, we like red lights and green lights, we don't like yellow lights. But then when we get into the regulatory dialogue, it seems like all industry wants is yellow lights. They want the possibility to do something. They don't want to be prescriptively told you can't do this or you have to do that. And so there's benefit in having these kind of narrative approaches. And I think EPA and the states have been fairly forward-looking in structuring obligations for industry that they need to be held accountable to. I think that's critical. That said, science has evolved. We have to consider the best available science, and there's a lot more that can be done to define forward-looking programs, as both professors have indicated, and we're fully in support of that.
Thank you. Robin, do you want to jump in and respond to that? I guess I want to observe that, even just in the public interest environmental community, there is not necessarily consensus between, whether, narrative standards versus numeric standards are favorable or ideal for a number of reasons. Anything that you want to sort of observe on that front or respond to?
I'll just throw in, that's one of the trickiest issues, I think, in a climate change adaptation context, because, numeric standards, hard standards may be out of date faster than we think they're going to be. But if you're not very careful about how you phrase a narrative standard, it can be very easy to interpret as giving all the flexibility Chris has mentioned as potentially problematic. It depends on exactly what context you're talking about. If you're talking about facility design and storage, I would think we would want a combination of what engineers actually could accomplish right now, combined with a adequate margin of safety sort of narrative criterion that balances the realism of what's actually possible with the knowledge that what's safe now may not be safe in the future.
I have nothing more to add on that question, David, but I see we have a bunch of Q&A questions.
David, I just want to underscore that I'm not making a strong argument for narratives alone. We want robust programs. I just wanted to underscore that there are certain narrative obligations that already can be looked at as we move forward that require a lot of forward-looking action even today.
Absolutely understood. Thank you, Chris. So let me ask one more question before we jump into, there's some great questions already rolling in. But, Noah, I want to, I know we've probably have a lot of advocates joining us on this webinar, and you have been up to your elbows and working with the environmental public interest community in Virginia for a number of years on toxic and hazardous substances, research engagement, but also legislative advocacy. And so, these are not easy issues. And so my question for you is, do you have any advice, any guidance for how citizens can help make these issues resonate in the most compelling way possible with state lawmakers that, especially at this point in time with COVID and social unrest and issues at the fore, are complicated and difficult to develop policies for.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of protecting communities from toxic floodwaters, this is an EJ issue. I think it should be framed that way. One of the ways to get legislators' attention is just to show these photos of the proximity that you're talking, whether it's New England, New Haven, Providence, wherever, the proximity of industrial sites with highly hazardous chemicals to homes and schools and playgrounds. And so one strategy I would suggest at the local level is to really make some noise about plants in your community. Be asking questions about, well, what's in those tanks over there and who authorized it? And don't we have a right to know what is in those tanks that are 20 yards from our school? And on this issue, in my work, I found that there is a good local ally often, which is the local fire department, who is often in the dark, just like the rest of us are, about what is at the site. And the inventory forms that I mentioned earlier, they have to be filed annually. So it would be possible that a company files the form, switches the chemical that's stored in a certain tank, and no one knows about it for 12 to 15 months later. So be talking to your local fire chiefs. And then at the state level, when I engage in state level lobbying, it helps to talk about the threat to drinking water supplies. So this is not just about the pollution of a harbor or the death of fish, that a lot of these chemical storage tanks are located upstream from drinking water intakes. And so potentially hundreds of thousands of people are affected by a spill. And I would keep hammering home these themes. It's a public health issue, it's an EJ issue, it's a first responder issue.
Excellent. Thanks, Noah. So I'm looking at one of the messages, or sorry, the questions here in the chat, and it's about coastal restoration and resilience projects and how they relate to this issue. And I'm thinking through in a couple states where we're working, where there are coastal resilience master planning in progress and state adaptation planning in process. And a lot of focus on resilience projects, green infrastructure, things of those nature. And so I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts, sort of broadly on how to connect resilience project planning and selection along our coasts, for example, to prevention and mitigation of toxic flooding and toxic contamination? And from where you're working or focusing on your research, if that's New England or Virginia, any specific examples you could share with our audience? So let me ask Chris if you'd be willing to field that question first.
Well, not to be a broken record, a concern. The answer is yes. Can they help reduce risks? No question. Very important. And the planning is critical. The municipal focus on a lot of these issues that we're seeing is critical. But one of the dynamics that we're very concerned about is industrial facilities really frozen in time, not adapting. Major for-profit enterprises that are subject to regulation, our view, in violation of federal law if they're failing to take certain actions, perhaps state or local law as well. But then advocating for big public infrastructure projects. And there's a fair share component here. We don't think it's fair and appropriate, although this is a major societal problem that needs to be addressed at all levels. We totally understand why states and cities are filing lawsuits against the fossil fuel industry, for example, but there's accountability even beyond that in the regulatory programs where major industrial actors have to do their part, even as we see these coastal restoration and resilience projects that are often much more broad in terms of stakeholder involvement and who's driving them, governments oftentimes, often taxpayer funded. We just need the big picture to be seen and all entities involved to be doing their fair share. We don't want those investments undermined by a failure to protect industrial facilities.
I would just throw in, the terminology here gets a little tricky. So when I hear about coastal restoration, I kind of wince a little bit. So if it's restore in the sense of we're trying to put it back the way it was and not considering where the sea is actually going to be and where coastal wetlands might actually survive, it might end up with a lot of money spent and not doing a whole lot of good if what you're trying to restore is going to be open ocean in a matter of years. But if you're thinking about cleaning up sites, about retrofitting buildings, if you're thinking about starting maybe wetlands, which are generally very good at sequestering toxics, in places where they are going to be able to survive over the next 20 years. If you're anticipating a moving coastline or a moving floodplain, if you're in the interior, yeah, they can help. Will they take care of everything without cleaning up and dealing with some of the problems that are already there? Probably not.
And I'll just add really quickly that sometimes this issue is used by the chemical industry to say, to throw up their hands and say, we don't really have a role, because responding to sea level rise needs to be a global, national, at least a state issue. It doesn't make sense to look at an individual site with respect to sea level rise. And yet it does, because we're talking about, well, are you prepared for that sea level rise? Do your toxic chemicals need to be in that location, or could you move them off site? Is there any way to make them mobile so that in the event of a hurricane, it might be possible to move the most hazardous chemicals? So it's just a red herring to say, oh, it's beyond the ability of one company to plan for.
Yeah, I like that idea about the possibility of moving hazardous chemicals away from risk, even temporarily, obviously. We've got a couple questions coming in, Noah, that I think kind of driving at land use, and maybe seeking a little bit more detail from you on your research and recommendations in that space. One comment noting that the city of Norfolk in Virginia has adopted some new local regulations on land use, and that there's some progress there to move industry to higher ground, which I imagine has its own pros and cons for people that live there. But then also another comment noting that how do planners, leaders in Houston, which is a huge energy hub for the United States, how do they even begin to approach this issue of reforming land use and moving heavy industry away from these climate risks?
Yeah, in my article, I had to recognize that some industrial uses need to be near water. And there's no doubt about that. If you're building a port, certain storage terminals, barges, it's got to be there. And so I'm realistic about what can be done with a city like Houston, highly dependent on the ship channel. And so I'm not expecting that everyone is just going to pick up and move their facilities. But Houston's a good example because it's experienced such tremendous growth in the past 40 years. So it ought to be looking out to mid-century and beyond and planning its future growth. And is there any way to move that further inland so that it's not right on the Galveston-Houston ship channel?
Well, I see that we're running up on the end of the hour here, so I'm gonna, if you'll humor me, I'd like to ask one more question. For folks who are attending this webinar, we'll follow up and try to answer these questions in writing the best we can. So my last question is, well, it's one that a lot of people are fielding these days. And so there are probably 1,000,001 prescriptions for what should be that one policy on day one of the Biden administration, right? What is that one pet policy, the most impactful thing? And so specific to this issue, right, of climate-driven pollution and chemical disaster, what does that one policy, program, initiation of a rulemaking, for example, that you think the next EPA administrator should tackle on that figurative day one? And Robin, I'll toss that to you first to respond, please.
Okay, well, now see, I was going to go with the administration overall, and I would say re-engaging with the rest of the world on climate was probably more important initially, first off, than anything we do domestically. But if we're going to pin it to the EPA, personally, I really would make it a hard look at reprioritizing the national priorities list under CERCLA and making sure that the priorities that got sites where they were at the time are still the priorities they should be occupying, and reenact the tax while we're at it, but that's Congress.
Thanks, Robin.
I'll give you two.
Please.
It's promulgating the regulations I mentioned on hazardous spill regulations for hazardous substance storage tanks, which have been long neglected. And the second is reform of the flood insurance program. We can't continue to subsidize companies to locate in flood prone areas, just making the problem worse.
That leaves you, Chris.
Well, I'm lucky because I get to agree with the prior ones in addition to adding my own. But the list could become unwieldy if we're not careful. I think making it absolutely clear that the National Flood Insurance Program maps do not serve as a design basis for anything in the coastal or floodplain environment, period. We got to stop having this debate. It's not the place to start. We need to start looking at the models and the available tools that actually show the risks we're dealing with now across a broad range of programs. And I would urge a very strong enforcement posture around climate change, including in the Superfund program, acknowledging the third-party right of contribution. I think the fossil fuel industry should be dragged into paying for the next phase of cleanup and protection at Superfund sites, because a lot of people that responded to EPA and spent billions of dollars to stabilize and clean up those sites should be fairly tasked with cleaning them up further where they contributed pollution. But a lot of the impacts that are coming were caused and are known to be caused by another industry that should pay their fair share for that cleanup.
Excellent. Well, I'm not sure as moderator I'm allowed to agree with you all, but I agree with all of your policy prescriptions. I want to thank you again for joining us for this discussion, our third and final installment in this webinar series. Chris, Robin, Noah, thank you for your time and your thoughts and your work. Sure. And with that, I'll wish everyone a great rest of their day. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.